On June 19, 1865, about 2,000 Union troops, led by General Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas, to break the news to the last remaining Confederate sympathizers that they had lost the Civil War, and all slaves, more than 250,000, must be freed. He read to the residents of Galveston, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Hello. This is King Channel TV. We are bringing you another video in compliance with Sections 107 and 106 of the U.S. Copyright Act, for information and educational purposes. What I just quoted was the date and historical event that brought about the cause and remembrance of Juneteenth. First, the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States. This phrase means the people holding slaves within those designated areas were in rebellion against the United States, and that all slaves shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. Lincoln recognized that it would have to be followed by a constitutional amendment in order to guarantee the abolition of slavery. Second, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment was formed to bring a lasting end to slavery in the United States. It was passed at the end of the Civil War before the Southern states had been restored to the Union, and should have easily passed in Congress. However, though the Senate passed it in April 1864, the House initially did not. At that point, Lincoln took an active role to ensure its passage through Congress. He insisted that passage of the 13th Amendment be added to the Republican Party platform for the upcoming 1864 presidential election. The Republican Party ruled the House of Representatives in 1864. They coincided with the 1864 United States presidential election, in which President Lincoln was re-elected. President Lincoln's efforts met with success. The House passed the bill in January 1865 with a vote of 119 to 56. On February 1, 1865, President Lincoln approved the joint resolution of Congress submitting the proposed amendment to the state legislature. 2 months later, April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated. With the assassination of President Lincoln, Andrew Johnson became the 17th President of the United States, 1865 through 1869. He was an old-fashioned Southern Jacksonian Democrat who believed strongly in states' rights views. 4 months later, the Juneteenth event took place. At the time of the events of Juneteenth, the 13th Amendment had been passed, but still had not been ratified. It still had not become a law. President Johnson imposed conditions whereby the Southern states could return to the United States in full standing. These conditions were: they would end slavery and never return to it, and they did not have to allow blacks the same rights that they had, like the right to vote, as a condition of readmission. The necessary number of states, 3/4, ratified it around December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution became law, a law which supposedly brought all slavery in the United States to an end. With the adoption of the 13th Amendment, the United States found a final constitutional solution to the issue of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." It has an exception clause that reads as if slavery was shifted from one set of black people to another set of black people, and involuntary servitude was added. Scholars, activists, and now many in Congress believe it was purposefully put. They have linked that exception clause to the rise of a prison system that incarcerates black people at more than 5 times the rate of white people and profits off of their unpaid or underpaid labor to this day. Let us continue. The curse of the 13th. Many believe there is something sinister about the number 13, just unlucky. So they try to avoid it in every aspect of their lives. But for the black people stolen from the shores of Africa and shipped to what came to be a strange and cruel land for them, the 13th had caught them, and today, their descendants are in its loophole without justice or mercy. Let's look at some of the hardships the 13th Amendment brought to the newly freed slaves and their descendants today. This loophole in the 13th Amendment resulted in the Southern states passing the Black Codes between 1865 and 1866. The Black Codes effectively continued enslavement for Black Americans by restricting their rights and exploiting their labor. Slavery had been a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and the former Confederate states sought a way to continue this system of subjugation. These codes criminalized normal human activities of black people to make it easy for black people to be imprisoned, effectively forcing them into servitude once more. The black codes created new types of offenses, especially attitudinal offenses. Not showing proper respect, those types of things. New offenses like malicious mischief were vague and could be a felony or misdemeanor depending on the supposed severity of behavior. They prohibited loitering, vagrancy. If there were 3 or 4 black people standing around talking, they were actually vagrant and could be convicted of a crime and sent to jail. In addition to criminalizing joblessness for black people, the codes required them to sign annual labor contracts that ensured they received the lowest pay possible for their work. Failing to sign a labor contract could result in the offender being arrested, sentenced to unpaid labor, or fined. The black codes not only forced black people to work for free, but also placed them under surveillance. These laws sent more black people to prison than ever before. And by the late 19th century the country experienced its first prison boom. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force black Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. Collectively, these regulations codified a permanent underclass status for black people. With the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the South rescinded the Black Codes, but the repeal of these restrictions didn't significantly improve life for black people. They shifted over to Jim Crow laws, which were kind of a perpetuation of the Black Codes. Employment options for black Americans remained limited. The loophole in the 13th Amendment also paved the way for Southern states to use convict leasing. Convict leasing provided white planters and industrialists leased prisoners to work for them. States and private businesses made money doing this, but prisoners didn't. Like chattel slavery before it, convict leasing was brutal and inhumane. Across the entire United States, tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly black, were leased by the state to plantation owners, privately owned railroad yards, coal mines and road-building chain gangs, and made to work under the whip from dawn till dusk, often as punishment for petty crimes such as vagrancy or theft. Many prisoners died in these conditions. By many accounts, conditions under the convict leasing system were harsher than they had been under slavery, as these private companies no longer had an ownership interest in the longevity of their laborers, who could be easily replaced at low cost by the state. Texas operated 12 state prison farms, and nearly 100% of the workers on them were black. More than 3,500 prisoners died in Texas between 1866 and 1912, the year Texas outlawed convict leasing because the death toll was so high. And, as with convict leasing before it, those sentenced to serve on chain gangs were predominantly black. Chain gangs existed into the 1940s. Today, states and private companies still rely on prisoners performing free or extremely low-paid labor for them. For example, California saves up to $100 million a year, according to state corrections spokesman Bill Sessa, by recruiting incarcerated people as volunteer firefighters. Although the incarcerated people subjected to this treatment sought redress from the courts, they found little relief. Time and again, the courts approved of this abusive use of convict labor, confirming the Virginia Supreme Court's declaration in 1871 that an incarcerated person was, in effect, a slave of the state. Let us move forward. This loophole in the 13th Amendment also paved way for the 1994 crime bill. It divided black people, terrorized and brought fear to many black communities all over the country, as many of us referred to it as the Three Strikes You're Out bill. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was sponsored by Joe Biden 28 years ago. It is often blamed for extending tough-on-crime policies that overly criminalize black Americans. Let's review.
We are still having conversations about the import and significance of the bill.
That 1994 crime bill, it did contribute to mass incarceration in our country.
It's important that people remember the context of the political environment in the early 1990s.
The other big piece of legislation on Capitol Hill tonight is the crime bill.
Now, violent crime peaked in 1991, and the drafters of the bill didn't know that in 1993 and 1994 when they were drafting and signing it. Urban areas, urban cities across the country were ravaged by crack cocaine, and Americans were afraid of crime. The 1994 crime bill was signed by President Bill Clinton. This was a pretty significant bill at the time, and President Clinton and Senator Biden at the time were right that the bill was significant.
The most significant federal effort to deal with violent crime in America that has ever been undertaken.
It was important for a Democrat at the time to be seen as taking a significant role in trying to reduce crime and violence in the United States. And at the time, the Congressional Black Caucus was part of the debate around the crime bill. And the Congressional Black Caucus didn't want every provision that was included in this bill. It became clear that the provisions in the 94 crime bill were going to be a political compromise. And so the history is much more complicated than is sometimes portrayed by the media. Now, what did the bill do? Just like a lot of political compromises, there was the good and there was the bad. For example, the bill eliminated 19 types of semi-automatic assault weapons. It also provided huge amounts of funding to hire cops. 100,000 cops were funded. It was about $14 million at the time for community policing. The bill also enacted the Violence Against Women Act that provided funding to protect women and victims of domestic violence and crimes against women. But the most pernicious provision of the 1994 crime bill was its $12 billion that was authorized for states across the country that would enact what's called truth in sentencing laws. That funding literally paid states to increase the number of prison beds that they allocated for individuals convicted of violent crime in this country to serve 85% of their sentences behind bars. The reason that provision is so important and the reason we're still talking about it today is the federal government essentially subsidized states across the country to build more prisons. So 25 years later, the crime bill is being debated.
You stood up and used that tough on crime, phony rhetoric.
That bill was a huge mistake.
There's no question that that crime bill contributed to America's mass incarceration problem.
1994 crime bill, we had a gigantic epidemic in America of violence, particularly in African American communities. The notion was overwhelmingly supported. It was supported by the Black Caucus in the United States Senate by and large.
And the reason that the crime bill comes up so often is, today in 2019, it is hard for so many people to understand why the federal government would pay states to incarcerate more people, given the devastating consequences we know that incarceration causes. But at the time, policymakers felt the need to respond to what they felt was uncontrolled violence, and this bill was the way that policymakers, that Congress could say, or do something about it.
Violent crime and the fear it provokes are crippling our society. The crime bill before Congress gives you a chance to do something about it, a chance to be tough and smart.
We need to examine the crime bill and all of the federal bills that galvanized prison spending, that galvanized more arrests, more incarceration, and we need to look to the future. And today, the United States leads the world in terms of incarceration. In fact, if each state were its own country, 23 states would have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Any candidate running for election who's serious about criminal justice reform, who's serious about cutting the prison population by 50%, needs to take a hard look at what has worked and hasn't worked in terms of our past criminal justice policies and understand that federal funding to increase the number of beds in prisons across the country is simply not a way to create safer and healthy.
All thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up, and thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed always. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 33, KJV. And so it was, and so it continues to be. Prison labor has been a part of the U.S. economy since at least the late 19th century, migrating from slave labor. As American slavery was, today it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Incarcerated workers are not included in official employment statistics, and there's not a ton of economic research done on this topic. So it can be difficult to know just how substantial this sector of the U.S. economy it actually is. So, this suspected multi-billion-dollar industry could be just a drop in the bucket of what it really is. Juneteenth was signed into law. Many advocates are arguing that its recognition does not go far enough and that Congress should act to extend the protections that the 13th Amendment provides and remove the exception clause. They say Juneteenth is now a federal holiday, but when major U.S. corporations benefit overwhelmingly from free to near free prison labor, endorsed by the Constitution, Juneteenth's cause is mute. Senator Jeff Merkley, an Oregon Democrat, introduced companion legislation in the Senate. We must recognize the lasting impact of slavery and that justice and freedom are still too often denied to Black Americans, and recommit to building a more just country that allows for slavery as punishment for a crime. Merkley wrote, "This clause has fueled re-enslavement and mass incarceration for generations and must be removed. They are calling for an abolition amendment to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution that would be a placeholder for Juneteenth and be the foundation upon which Juneteenth stands."
But we also have other things that we have to work on around Juneteenth, and you mentioned the educational piece, and we have to work on that exception in the U.S. Constitution, TJ.
Arnett, I want one more thing before we get to the Constitution here. You don't find it's just a matter of time? You don't think it's necessarily any resistance? Are you seeing any real resistance out there in terms of the states against making this a state holiday as well, or as you say, it's just a matter of time?
Oh, I am absolutely sure that there's some resistance. When I was in the state Senate just 3 years ago, I filed legislation to make Juneteenth a state holiday here in Georgia, and I couldn't even get a hearing on the bill. So I was thrilled to get to Congress and then be able to be one of the members who was able to vote on this to make it a federal holiday. So there's absolutely some resistance, but we keep moving and keep working in this country because we understand that we want to recognize our freedom in this country that was for far too long held back from us.
All right, let's talk about freedom now. And there's a loophole to that freedom that I want to put up for folks here. The actual text of the 13th Amendment, which you said needs to be changed. It actually says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Now, to you, that reads that folks could still be subject to slavery or involuntary servitude if they are criminals, and you believe this should be changed. Do you really think that still leaves would you call that still a loophole to possibly still slavery in this country?
It's not what I think, TJ, is what I know. The Constitution has that one exception clause, and we need to get rid of that exception. We need to end the exception and abolish slavery once and for all in this country. There are over 2 million incarcerated individuals in the United States right now that are subjected to this clause in the Constitution. And if we truly want to live up to the ideals of what Juneteenth means, we need to abolish this exception in the U.S. Constitution and end slavery once and for all. There are still 5 states in this country, Georgia, my home state is included, where if you're incarcerated, you can still be forced into labor for 0 pennies. We need to do something about this. There's a growing tide of people across the country. Alabama has this on their ballot this year. It passed their legislature unanimously in the state House and the state Senate, and it's going to go before the voters this year. Deeply red states like Utah and progressive states like Colorado both have gotten rid of this in their state constitution, and it's time that we do this for every state in the country.
And Congresswoman, there are states where prisoners do work and they do get a wage. It's still almost 50 cents an hour, if you will, or less. Do you think that should go away as well, or do you believe there's actually maybe a wage that's okay for prisoners to have while they're in prison?
So this is about forced labor, TJ. So I know that there are states where prisoners volunteer to sign up for programs so that they can get early release and so that they can gain skills. And that's not what we're talking about in this case. What we're talking about is forced labor where people that are incarcerated in this country are sent out and forced to do this work by virtue of losing their rights because they've been incarcerated. And that is slavery in this country, and the U.S. Constitution allows it. We have to understand where this came from. It was so that black men could be rearrested and put back into the fields to do the work of people that once enslaved them for loitering or for any minor infractions. People were arrested, and then all of a sudden, they didn't have to be freed in this country. And that's what we're addressing.
You know, I know everybody knows it's pretty difficult to get the Constitution changed, but why is this so important for you to lift that language out of the Constitution?
So it is difficult to get the Constitution changed, but I have a bipartisan group, a bicameral group of legislators that are leading this charge with me. I mean, I don't know what the woman representing Atlanta, Georgia, and a man representing Utah have in common, but we are working together, Representative Chris Stewart, to get this done. And so this is bipartisan legislation. I have 140 co-sponsors, and the number is continuing to grow.
A man in Utah, a woman in Georgia. I'm sure there's a lot that you have in common if we just stop and calmly talk to each other sometimes, right? But last thing here, I know we're only a year in. What's your hope for Juneteenth in the future?
My hope for Juneteenth is a celebration for the entire country because it recognizes the freedom of everyone in the United States. Happy Juneteenth, TJ.
Happy Juneteenth to you. Congresswoman Williams, it's always good to have you on the program. Thank you so much, and please keep chatting it up with the folks in Utah, all right?